Thank you for tuning in to our continued Holy Week series. Today is Tuesday, so we're going to be focusing on the events of Holy Tuesday and just analyzing what happened, breaking it down, and seeing how we can apply what Jesus did in his message into our lives. So I would like for you to join me. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 through 27, kind of looking at where Jesus is calling out the danger of empty religion, false faith. And so that's basically essentially saying he's calling out faith that looks alive, right? But on the outside, it bears no fruit. So we're going to look at that, and I'm going to start out with this question here. Hopefully many of you can relate to it, but have you ever been disappointed in something, right? Something that looked so great on the outside, but when you saw the inside of it or you got into it, you were very, very disappointed. It might have been something that was like a piece of fruit, right? That was looked so good on the inside, but you bit into it and it was rotten, right? Maybe it was a place. It looked great on the outside, but when you saw the ugliness of the inside, it was bad, right? Maybe it's a person. They dressed right. They said the right things. They flattered you, but you eventually saw the real them and that it was just a show and a sham. We've all been disappointed in our lives. We've all seen disappointment, and unfortunately it's part of our life. But on Tuesday, essentially, of Holy Week, Jesus encounters kind of this exact same situation, not just once, but twice on this day. So first off, we know he kind of sees the fig tree, and we go through that, and then he has a run-in with the religious elite. So we're going to kind of tackle that today about both the tree and the religious elites. They both looked alive, but on the inside, they bore no fruit. They bore no real substance. And Jesus addressed that because God's not impressed by appearances. Let's go ahead and get that straight. God's not impressed by appearances. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you look like, what you sound like. He's not impressed by that. He's looking for authenticity. And he's not just seeking leaves, he's seeking fruit in your lives. So is your life producing fruit? That is something that you need to reflect on as we go throughout this message. But and the question is, just am I living with a real rooted faith, or am I just putting on religious leaves? So we're going to go ahead and begin in Matthew 21, verses 18 through 27. I'm going to read the scripture, and I hope you will join me as we do this. In the morning, as Jesus was returning to Jerusalem, he was hungry. And he noticed a fig tree beside the road. He went over to see if there were any figs, but there were only leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." And immediately the fig tree withered up. Verse 20, the disciples were so amazed when they saw this and asked, "How did the fig tree wither up so quickly?" Then Jesus told them, "I tell you the truth. If you have faith and don't doubt, you can do things like this and much more. You can even say to this mountain, 'May you be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' and it will happen. You can pray for anything, and if you have faith, you will receive it." Verse 23, when Jesus returned to the temple and began teaching, the leading priests and the elders came up to him. They demanded, "By what authority are you doing all these things? Who gave you that right?" "I'll tell you by what authority I do these things if you can answer one question," Jesus replied. "Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human?" They talked among themselves, and it said, if we say it was from heaven, he will ask us why we didn't believe John. But if we say it was merely human, we will be mocked because the people believed John was a prophet. So they finally just replied to Jesus, "We don't know." And Jesus responded to that. He said, "Then I won't tell you by what authority I do these things." May God bless the hearing and reading of this word. So as Jesus walked toward the city on that Tuesday morning, he was hungry, and he wasn't just physically hungry, but he was spiritually hungry too. He was hungry to see faith. He was hungry to find fruit among God's people. So we're going to look here, we're going to start with this fig tree part here, and I want to break this down, and because it's got a really great message to it. So I encourage you just to follow along here. Jesus is walking by again. He's hungry physically, but he's hungry, spiritually as well. So we kind of see both of these as like parallel to each other. And so he sees this fig tree in the distance. And again, back in the day, fig trees were a abundant tree in the area. It was very popular, and most of them, if they grew right, they had a bunch of leaves and they had fruit on them. If they were grown well, they had fruit on them. Even if it was just blooming, it had small fruit on it at least. But this fig tree had nothing at all. And Jesus uses that when he gets that to point out and say, your faith is almost like this fig tree. It looks alive and vibrant on the outside. We see these leaves growing on it, and it looks great. But when I show up to it, there's no fruit that's bearing off of that tree. There's no substance to this tree. Like Jesus is pretty much saying, what good is this tree if it doesn't produce fruit? It's just for looks, right? That's essentially what he's saying about this tree here, and it becomes a living parable. This is something that we see. He's not just, walking by, I don't like the tree, curse the tree, There's a reason behind what he, why he did what he did. And this is example. He makes it a living parable here, and he wants us to see the danger of having the appearance of faith without the evidence and the substance of it. So again, we're looking at that, and that's what happens, and we have to ask ourselves the question, is my faith bearing fruit, or is it just putting on leaves? Think about that. I've did a sermon on this before about bearing fruit in our lives and looking at the kind of fruit we can bear in our lives. And so I want to encourage you, and I'll try to put the link somewhere in this video for you to go watch that, because that's an incredible lesson there to learn what fruit are we producing. Are we producing bad fruit, good fruit, or what this is kind of touching on, fake fruit, where things look good on the outside, but when you really bite into the fruit, it's nasty, it's rotten. And so there's I'm going to try to put that in there, but so we move into here and verses 18 through 19, we see that. And that passage can catch us off guard because, especially for a new Christian, they're reading this and they're probably asking, why would Jesus curse a tree for not having fruit? That's kind of weird, that's kind of harsh, maybe ridiculous, some people might say, but I can assure you it wasn't that he was doing it just because he was mad at a tree, right? We think in human terms here, we walk along and we're hungry, saw a tree that didn't have any fruit, we'd probably curse it out too, similar to how we go to a drive-through nowadays and it doesn't have what we want, we'll probably curse them out, right? This is that's what our mindset initially goes to, but Jesus had a reason for doing this. He was using it as a visible lesson because his disciples were there, right? We saw that. They asked him why he did that. But he made this a visible lesson about what happens when an outward appearance masks inner emptiness. Again, the fig tree looked so good from a distance, but it looked alive, but when he approached it, it was deceptively barren. And this is just, again, more than a lesson just in agriculture, horticulture right there and that. It's actually, again, a living parable, something that we can compare to and learn a lesson from what Jesus is saying here. And especially this parable is almost doing a reflection of Israel's spiritual state here, right? Because right now, at this time, Israel, their spiritual state, especially with the religious leaders, is not good. One, we had people on Palm Sunday. Remember, we talked about that. They were, celebrating Jesus coming in, but they didn't understand what he was there for. They thought he was there to overthrow the government and do all this other stuff, political stuff. They saw him as a king of politics, not a king of eternity, okay? Remember that. And so there's that going on, but also at the same time, the religious leaders, the people of the temple, remember yesterday we talked about Jesus going into the temple and he is throwing these tables up and he is like cleaning house, essentially. He's cleaning house of the temple and cleaning it out from all these vendors and different things like that, and allowing the people that were not allowed to come in before, the sick and the blind, to come in for him to heal. So Jesus did that. He cleaned out the house there, but we were able to see the religious leaders didn't like it, right? So that we kind of see this tension building up, and it reflected on that, right? This parable was reflecting on Israel's state, spiritual state, because the religious leaders were not doing what they were supposed to do. They had all the signs spiritually. They had the temple, they had the sacrifices, the garments, they had everything looking right on the outside, but truthfully on the inside there was no repentance, there was no justice, there was no mercy or true faith. This fig tree is what basically we would call nowadays false advertising, right? That's almost what was going on at the temple. as well, and Jesus called it out. And essentially, Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5 references this a little bit. He says, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Now, have nothing to do with such people. So Jesus, again, wasn't condemning the people for failing. He was confronting them for the danger of faking, because it is such a dangerous part. We live in a culture, though, too, that teaches us how to look the part, right? That is such a very important part, because our world focuses on the looks of things and not the internal part of things. We know how to raise our hands in worship, and we can post Bible verses on social media. We can say the right words, and we can make sure we go to church on Easter and Christmas, right? And we'll make sure we take our pictures and post it on Facebook, so that way people know that we went to church, so they can, that we look good, right? But when Jesus comes close and He looks us straight in the eye, when He looks beyond all our leaves that we can put on the outside, what is He going to find? Is He going to find maybe emptiness? Is He going to find that your heart's maybe full of the wrong things? Remember yesterday I said Jesus can't feel what's already been filled. If your life is full of things that are irrelevant to Christ, and we allow busyness to fill that up, but if we do things that aren't important, if we allow sin in the world to take up our heart and there's no room for Jesus, that's not a good thing. We can look great on the outside, but on the inside, that faith, it will tell the truth, right? Jesus isn't looking for performance. He's simply looking for fruit. He's looking for authentic fruit. He's looking for authentic people. He's not, again, concerned about your outside appearance. He doesn't care what it looks like on social media. Again, hey, let me say this. Jesus knows your heart. He knows everything about you. You can't fool Jesus, right? There's no way you can fool God, because He is almighty and ever powerful. He knows what the truth is. There's no way of fooling. Just how Adam and Eve in the garden, right? They thought they could fool God, but they couldn't, because He knew. He already knew. So there's no escape of lying to God or trying to get out of things with God, because He can see right through our lie and our shield. Okay, that is so important. You can't fake things for so long, because again, there's evidence of fruit in our lives. There's Galatians chapter 5 verses 22 through 23. The fruit of the Spirit is going to say, this is what we need to have in our lives. We need to have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But these things you can't fake from. So many people think, well, yeah, I can fake love, I can do this if I can fake it. But they grow from a life connected to the true vine. I'm referencing John chapter 15, verse 5 there. I am the vine. Jesus is the true vine. And then so even moving further from this, we're going to look at verse 21. It says, truly I tell you. So after Jesus turned to disciples, they questioned Him about how did that tree wither like that? Why did it wither so fast? They kind of questioned that, and then Jesus is going to start talking about the faith here in verse 21. He's referencing again the true faith. He says, truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, even if you say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, it will be done. He doesn't mean literally, right? But he's using that as a reference that Jesus isn't condemning fake faith. He's inviting real faith. And that faith that He's inviting, that real faith, will believe that God can work in impossible places. That faith will believe that God, that faith trusts even when you don't see fruit yet. That faith, it roots itself in God, and it's not just religious activity. So those are so important, because that's elements of real pure faith and worship. So just ask yourself these, where is an area in my life right now where I'm more focused on appearance and substance? Why? What is my fruit in my faith producing right now? Am I walking in prayer and belief, or am I just going through the motions? And so, again, essentially, that fig tree was a living parable. This looks alive from a distance, but up close, it's spiritually dead. And again, we're going to transition now to the religious leaders. What does this fig tree and religious leaders have to do in common? Well, they're actually both representing the same thing right here. So we're going to tackle that. And so remember, though, I want to give a little bit of context what happened on Monday. Remember, we talked about this yesterday. Jesus had already went to the temple. He was on a mission, right? He had exposed, just the day before on Monday, the temple to be a den of thieves, right? He said, "You've turned my house of worship into a den of thieves." Now he returns to the same temple, and he's immediately challenged by those same leaders, the ones that had the power but no purity and titles and no truth, and they thought they had authority in name but not from God. And just like that fig tree we just talked about, their form of godliness had no fruit of righteousness, right? So Jesus is coming back to the temple. In verses 23 here, we're going to see Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked. "Who gave you this authority?" Well, again, these religious leaders, they had enough, because Jesus came in and completely, quite literally, actually flipped the tables on them, and they were just completely caught off guard. They were embarrassed, and then they felt they were just, just completely thrown off right there. And they, again, had enough. So they interrupted him with a pointed question. "Why are you doing? Who gave you the authority to do this? By whose authority? Who gave you that right to come into my temple and do these things?" And that it wasn't because they were curious, right? They weren't just simply seeking that. They felt threatened because Jesus came and literally turned the tables on them. And Jesus challenged their control and their system and their public image. And now, instead of repenting, these religious leaders try to attack him in a way, but they try to trap him with a question about power. They're going to try to, we're going to, really try to see if we can get a hold of Jesus here and prove him wrong, right? So Jesus, how he famously kind of does, right? He answers a question with a question, okay? That's what he does here. He responds with a question of his own by saying, I'll also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? And on Jesus' end, I know he's all things, and he, already knew what to say before they even asked. But it was brilliant because Jesus wasn't avoiding the initial question, but he was flipping the table, again, literally, on their hearts and exposing their hearts. Because if the religious elite there, if they acknowledged that it was from heaven, John's authority was from heaven, then they would have had to admit John's message was true, and then therefore John had been pointed to Jesus as the Lamb of God, right? But that was, again, that was what they didn't want to go that route. But if they would have said from men, right, then they would upset the crowds, right? They were worried about their public image here because the crowds loved John the Baptist. They believed that he was a prophet. So again, they took the easy way out. They just said, we don't know, And Jesus replied, well, since you don't know, I'm not going to tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. You don't need to know. You should know that it's from God. If you were in the right space, if you were truly doing these right things, you would know from God. But he decided not to answer that because he, again, shouldn't be questioned because these religious elites, again, they were just threatened by him. They didn't even really, try to expect try to open up to what Jesus was doing here. So, again, these religious elites, they wasn't ignorant. They were just, it was willful blindness. And they knew the truth deep down. I feel like they did. But their pride and things like that, it wouldn't let them admit it, okay, that Jesus was there and he was the true living Son of God. So, again, here's the danger. If you care more about protecting your position or your image than submitting to God's authority, then you'll always miss the truth. Again, I want to say that again. When you care more about protecting your position or your image than submitting to God's authority, you will always miss the truth. Those religious leaders, they wore the right robes, they had the best and right seats, they had the best titles, the right titles. They had no authority from heaven, though, because they were not submitted to heaven's king. However, Jesus had authority. Even though he refused to tell the religious elites whose authority he had, He actually does, and it's based through Scripture here, and I want to share these with you. Jesus had authority to teach. That's in Matthew chapter 7, verse 29. Jesus had the authority to forgive sins. That was in Mark chapter 2, verse 10. Jesus had the authority to drive out demons in Luke chapter 4, verse 36. And Jesus had the authority to lay down his life and take it up again in John chapter 10, verse 18. But they still rejected it, not because they didn't see the signs, but they didn't want to surrender. They were too prideful. They had an ego, essentially. They didn't want to surrender to that. So allow me to ask you this. Do you follow Jesus only when it fits your comfort zone? Am I focused more on defending my position or my image than listening to God's correction? And finally, when Jesus challenged me, do I respond with surrender or do I respond with resistance? Do I let my pride and ego get in the way? Or am I going to fully put my true faith and trust in God? Our reflection here, just real fast, we want to realize who has the authority over our life. And maybe you have some areas in your life right now that your pride and ego has tried to maintain control of, and you haven't given Jesus access to it. I want to encourage you today to allow Jesus into that. So the confrontation sets the stage for everything that follows in Holy Week. As we talked about on Sunday, there was a little bit of tension that started. Monday, the tension really started kicking off. Tuesday, again, they were really starting to get tense because Jesus, basically again told them off in a way. He's like, look, I'm here to do what God has sent me to do. And they didn't like that answer. So the tension keeps growing. And so Jesus is making it clear he's not just a teacher. He is truly the Son of God. And he's not going to play along with the man-made religion that we came up with. So again, does Jesus have a spot in your life? Or are we just simply, not putting him on a schedule? Hey, we'll give an hour to you on Sunday and none the rest of the week, right? That shouldn't be how we do it. Again, as we wrap up, on Tuesday of this Holy Week, Jesus gave us two powerful moments and two scenes that on the surface seem kind of different, right? Like, what does a fig tree have to do with religious elites? But when we really dive into it, we see these two are deeply connected. We see it's almost like a mirror image of each other. A fig tree looked alive, but it was empty. A group of religious leaders who sounded holy were prideful. A temple full of activity had no intimacy with God. What did they all have in common? They had leaves, but they had no fruit. And Jesus didn't overlook that. He confronted it because he loves us too much to let us settle for surface level faith. So tonight I want to ask you what Jesus might be asking you. Is your faith real or is it routine? Are you producing fruit or are you just showing off your leaves? So when are you going to give Jesus your full authority of your life? Or are you trying to stay in control and let your pride and ego drive the train? Again, Jesus isn't looking for perfection. He's looking for surrender. He's not asking you to fake it. He's asking you to be honest. Let him have it all. When we start acknowledging the emptiness and letting him feel it, we will feel so much better because we have Jesus literally filling our hearts and surrendering to that. And if you've been resisting his authority, please take time tonight to just talk to God, pray to him and say, Lord, I'm tired of faking it. I want to be real. I want to be pure with you. Take time to do that. I want to encourage you. Let Jesus plant real roots that will grow into lasting fruit. I want to conclude by this final verse here. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. That's John chapter 15, verse 8. I want to thank you all again for tuning in to Holy Week, our sermon series through this, and looking at Tuesday of Holy Week, and looking at how we can take a look at, something simple as the fig tree and the religious elites, and compare them, break them down, and look at how we can apply this into our personal lives. I thank you all for tuning in. I love you all, and we'll be praying for you. And tune in again tomorrow night. We'll be looking at Wednesday of Holy Week and seeing what happens there and how we can apply it.